Preface from the narrator. The following audiobook is a compilation of several serial style installments into the periodic publication called Florida Magazine just after the turn of the century, actually in 1902. As an historical account, I find this interesting as the magazine itself was published in an era prior to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, so I always find such documents very attractive, if for no other reason than to experience, even vicariously, the story of a people who were, although briefly, independent and free from debt slavery, but that's another topic altogether. I'll also mention that in 1902 and prior, because again, this was published in 1902, so the story that's told obviously would have happened, ostensibly in the late 1800s. Um, the story was written and even published in a time when certain technologies that we're all very familiar with and take for granted were not widely available, and a lot of them were not widely known, or even some of them didn't even exist. And so there is that element of this to keep in mind, without doing any spoilers. Just sort of keep that in mind throughout the work. As a Ball Earth skeptic, I find this serial story you're about to hear, The Iron Republic, extremely fascinating. Not because I necessarily believe every bit of it is an accurate, factual account of a far southern adventure with astonishing revelations, which it very well may be. I mean, it may all be 100% true. But that's not why I find it so fascinating. It shows that people were at least speculating such things even prior to, well prior to the 1955 polar excursions of Admiral Byrd, specifically the one called Operation High Jump, which, according to the U.S. military, was dubbed the flight beyond imagination, which to me is extremely telling and interesting, although very subtle and circumstantial. Agreed. A friend of mine, John Cooper, had recommended this serial set of stories to me several months ago, going on a year ago. And I actually began to read it, and I was really sort of upset or saddened that I only had access to the first one or two editions or serial installments, which means I was just getting to the good part. No spoilers, I promise. I was just getting to the good part when I could no longer read any further, so I was certainly left hanging and wanting more of the story. Then, several months later, my good buddy Jaron, yes, Jaronism, mentioned the same story, the Iron Republic story, to me and asked me if I was familiar with it because he had apparently read the whole thing. Um, One thing that was brought to my attention prior to reading the story in its entirety was an inconsistency with the author's style and sort of literary promise, which appears really close to the beginning of the first edition, or maybe the second. It was really close to the beginning of the whole thing. Without quoting this, verbatim, I'll just sort of paraphrase and state that the author mentions or alludes early on that he is essentially no Shakespeare, no literary genius, but he had such a compelling and interesting story that he felt obligated to tell in spite of his own admitted lack of literary prowess. Now, so he essentially states in the very beginning, reader be warned, no need to prepare yourself to be dazzled by literary genius and colorful imagery language, but instead, brace yourself for the most incredible true story that you could ever imagine from the perspective of a man who experienced such a wild adventure in all of its grit. Literary glamour or no, the reader should prepare for a wild ride. So that was definitely paraphrasing, and I guess I embellished on that a bit. But I certainly agreed with the author's estimation of their style during the first installment or two. But it appears that at some point the author abandoned this promise or foreshadowing, and as the entire story becomes exactly what the author warned us it would not be. So, wearing my tinfoil hat a little bit, which I, tend to take that on and off, but wearing my tinfoil hat, there is part of me that wonders whether the first few installments of the series were indeed true accounts by the original author, and then at some point the true story was either hijacked or possibly embellished upon by a totally new author, or perhaps an overzealous editor influenced the authentic author to make certain changes, exclude certain things, or include certain literary devices to increase the ratings or else. So I see that as a possibility, but yes, the entertainment business has always been fairly cutthroat from what I can gather. Now, again, this is all, a lot of speculation on my part, and I don't want to sway anyone's opinion of the story as a whole, because the mere premise of the tale is of primal intrigue and fascination, especially with the new revelations of late involving the shape and nature of the world. As a journalist and an amateur videographer, I wanted to share this with as many people as possible. And really, you have John Cooper to thank, and even Jeranism to thank. 'Cause really, if it wasn't for those two, I probably never would have made this or done this audiobook rendition. But this tells a tale of a land beyond the south, which in many ways echoes or parallels the ancient Norse myths of a land beyond the north. So it's just very interesting, and without further ado, just get ready to hear the accounts of Richard Jameson Morgan, as narrated by yours truly. This is John the Morgile, with selected compositions by Johann Sebastian Bach. Enjoy. Hey, what's up, everybody? Gonna do a sort of an audiobook reading of this very, very interesting publication. It's Florida Magazine from January of 1902, number 36254. This was a publication. The cover reads History, Science, Health, Fiction, Recreation, Fashion, Music Review. Single number is 10 cents. Published the first of each month at Jacksonville, Florida, USA. And the article in question is on page 75 of the PDF. If you can download the PDF, it's called the article is called "The Iron Republic" by Richard Jameson Morgan. All rights reserved. So I'll just get right into it. You can make what you want of it. I'm going to read this in its entirety. I'll put the pages up from the PDF as we go along, so you can read it. A lot of people just don't like to sit around and read. And so I'll do this as an audiobook format for those of you who don't like to. So, again, this is by Richard Jameson Morgan, all rights reserved, and this is The Iron Republic from Florida Magazine. With this number begins the remarkable narrative of Mr. E. W. Barrington, entitled, quote, "The Iron Republic," end quote. It may be unnecessary for the magazine to disclaim any responsibility for the truth of this extraordinary story. The writer claims to have absolute and demonstrable evidence of the truth of the article on board his vessel, now lying in Tampa Bay, but we have not had the opportunity to inspect these proofs. It is only fair to Mr. Barrington to say that he invites the public to come on board his ship and see it for themselves. Either as fact or fiction, it is a rare story and presents an ideal of society and government that will make the average reader long to be a citizen of the newly discovered Iron Republic. Dear Sir, since the visit of your representative to my vessel, I have thought over the matter and decided to respond to your invitation to give an account of my strange adventures for the benefit of your readers. I write the narrative for your magazine because you have been kind enough to ask for it, and because your interest and consideration is in marked contrast to that of other editors who have treated me with positive discourtesy, refusing to accept the statement of my experiences seriously. I am well aware that much of what I shall relate will appear incredible, and doubtless the whole story will be set down by many as a purely fanciful creation, like the fictions produced by Bellamy and other theorists within the past few years. About this matter, though, I give myself no concern, as the many incontrovertible proofs, documentary and otherwise, which I have on board, will, when presented to the proper authorities, receive the recognition of the government in due and proper form, as also that of geographical and scientific societies the world over. I regret that my narrative, proved and demonstrated as it will be, must unsettle scientific theories and make it necessary to reconstruct some of our social books. But while this will result in temporary inconvenience and shake the faith of some in the dicta of science, upon the whole the benefit will far exceed the injury. It is well to have our scientific theories unsettled every now and then, or we would become fossilized and arrogant like the bigots of the Middle Ages and oppose any further advance in knowledge. It is unnecessary to say that after my narrative has been accepted, the zetetic theory of the Earth as a plane will have to be recognized and the geographies made in conformity therewith. In writing this history of my adventures, I wish it distinctly understood that I make no pretensions to literary style or ability, and my account will probably be crude and faulty in many respects. My only effort will be to tell a round, unvarnished tale, true in every particular, for I realize that that is the only truthfulness that the story can be of any value. A man whose literary efforts have been limited to lawyers' briefs few and far between, and whose supremest and most extended written effort was a spread-eagle thesis on the science of politics, and the conclusion of an uneventful college career, cannot be expected to be a model of literary excellence. But to come to my story, in the autumn of '94, so we'll assume that 94 is 1894. So in the autumn of 1894, I was enjoying a comfortable practice in a flourishing county town in one of the greatest states of the Middle West. I say comfortable practice because it was one that entailed very little work and gave me plenty of time to devote to society and politics, for the latter of which I had always felt a strong predilection. My father had achieved some distinction as an officer in the Civil War and afterwards rose high in the politics of his state. It was the opinion of many that had he entered the arena of politics at an earlier period in life, he might have risen to the very highest office in the nation. It has always been my desire to emulate his political career, and the prestige of his name with my strong inclination for public life gave reasonable promise of success. Modesty forbids the mention of other reasons, though I already enjoyed some reputation as a speaker and was regarded by politicians throughout the state as a fighter and a coming man. I had adopted the profession of law as nearest allied to politics, and a brass plate bearing the name of J. Edward Barrington, attorney and counselor at law, adorned my door, though I was known in political circles as Ned Barrington and a, live wire. There was no great demand for my professional services, and I was not displeased that my social and political popularity far outshone my professional fame. The reader will understand my position when I say, by way of explanation, that I was not dependent upon my profession for support. My father, who died during my last year in college, having left an ample fortune for a young man of my steady habits and inexpensive tastes, and so at the time my story opens, I may say without offensive egotism that I was a rather promising young man of 24, with a clear conscience, infinite digestion, and, I say modestly, a fair share of good looks. I was a member of the Young Men's Christian Association, president of a flourishing literary club, and had been, for a year past, the chairman of the Republican Executive Committee of our county. I was also a leading spirit in local temperance society, and was supposed to have considerable influence with the better elements of society in the town and county. I had never been candidate for any office, but was a worker in my party, content to wait for my time. I am thus particular in these uninteresting details, because on them hinged the events that changed the whole course of my life, and gave me an experience that will, in all probability, make my name as familiar in future generations as that of Galileo or Columbus. The campaign of '94, again 1894, was a particularly heated one. Fatty Burkheit, a notorious dive-keeper, had been nominated by the Republican Party as the candidate for Congress from our district, and a wave of indignation swept over the country. Meetings were held, several of which I addressed, and this action of the party was condemned on all sides. The district was Republican by a large majority, but many lifelong Republicans declared that they would never vote for such a candidate. The Democratic Convention had nominated Buck McGee, an ex-prize fighter of a reputation so unsavory that the alternative of voting for the opposition candidate was not to be thought of. One evening in September, I was sitting before a comfortable fire in my library reading the evening paper when my office boy announced a party of gentlemen, supposing it was some members of the executive committee come to talk over the political situation or a party of friends to enjoy a rubber of whist. I had them ushered in. To abbreviate this part of my story as much as possible, it transpired that these gentlemen were members of the Democratic Committee and came with a proposition to cast the bulk of their party vote for me if I would permit myself to be brought forward as an independent candidate. They pointed out that the respectable element of the Republican Party demanded a candidate that it could vote for, and that with this vote and the support I would get from the Democratic Party, my election was assured. It is not necessary to dwell upon the details of that conference. Suffice it to say that the interest was so great and their reasoning so cogent that I consented in the interest of morality and good government to lead the movement. It seemed to be the providential opening to a great career, and when the enthusiasm occasioned by my acquiescence, the four gentlemen, who seemed to be men of wealth, shook hands with me and each other and pledged $1,000 apiece in support of the campaign against corruption. I could do no less than hand them a check for a like amount. This part of my narrative may be tiresome reading, but it is part of the story, and in telling a story, as in solving a problem, there's nothing like having all the factors stated at the very beginning. I will pass over the exciting events of that campaign in speeches I made, the letters received, commending, warning, threatening even. The abuse heaped upon me by members of my own party is all a part of the political history of the district. Up to the last week of the campaign, it seemed that my election was certain. A few days before the election, I was waited upon by a committee of, quote, workers with a letter of introduction from the chairman of the Democratic Committee, which stated that the support of these gentlemen was absolutely essential to my success at the polls. After reading the letter, I turned to the party, which had remained standing, and I asked, what could I do for them? Taking the stub of a cigar from his mouth and squirting a lot of tobacco juice in my carpet, the leader, a big-nosed Dutchman, made 2 or 3 awkward attempts to speak and finally blurted out something like the following, quote, "Dot's all right, Captain. You don wirst der Grede left der Politbox. Gut. I'd dax the monish der make der mar drot. See, we will give you the support if there zazun keepers for $10,000, which puts you in Congress, where ye can makes in the back on vote. See, you puts up der 10,000 ter showing der yund vote and goes to Congress. You don't put up und stays here home. And now which is it?" End quote. And replacing the cigar stub in his mouth and putting his arms akimbo, he looked for the word like a fiery fat jug with a handle on both sides. To say that I was astonished does not express it. I was utterly dumbfounded. The appearance of the men in my house had been an insult, and when the vile proposition was made, it was more than I could endure. Without standing on the quality of my English, I turned them summarily out of the doors. The balance is soon told. The Democrats voted solidly for their candidate, as it was intended they should, and as I drew about 50% of the Republican vote, a Democrat was elected to Congress for the first time in history of our district. I learned afterwards that if I had paid the $10,000, it would in no wise affected the result. The money I did advance was not used in furthering my candidacy at all, and the whole scheme was a device to divide and defeat the Republican Party in the district. By the way, as a side note here, just so you guys know, back then the Democrats were the ones who were basically pro-KKK and anti-civil rights and Now they've sort of switched masks or switched roles. It's all a false dichotomy, the whole Hegelian dialectic thing. So, anyways, continuing with the article, the morning after the election, I was the most universally hated man in the state. I was abused, ridiculed, cartooned. Even lifelong friends turned their backs upon me as a man who had sacrificed principle and sold himself in the vain hope of gratifying an inordinate political ambition. Some of those even who had supported my candidacy shook their heads dubiously and said there had been selling somewhere. So basically, they were saying he's sold out. This, with the natural mortification I felt having been used as a cat's paw and defeated, thus cutting off prematurely my anticipated political career, made existence a burden, and I determined to leave forever the scene of my disgrace. But where could I go? My name was familiar from one end of the country to the other. Even my features, from a half-page cartoon in a New York paper representing me as a cat's paw pulling out of the fire a most self-satisfied looking chestnut, which revealed the countenance of the successful Democratic candidate. After some bitter reflection, I decided to convert my property into money and purchased a vessel large enough and strong enough to bear me beyond the confines of civilization, for only there did I feel that I could escape from the scorn of my fellow men. My eventful voyage, my discovery of the, quote, Iron Republic, with its remarkable government and industrial conditions, my residence on this hitherto unknown continent, and study of its wonderful advancement in civilization and the arts of life, I will give an account of to the best of my ability in this narrative, which I trust may be as interesting as it is true. In the meantime, the people of Jacksonville are welcome on board my vessel at all times, where they will be at liberty to inspect the many articles of interest which I brought from the land which lies beyond the ice barriers of the Antarctic Circle. Chapter 2. As soon as possible after the disastrous termination of my first and last political campaign, I turned everything I had into gold, and going down to New York, bought the fine vessel which now lies in this harbor, somewhat the worse for wear, but still staunch and seaworthy. I shipped a good crew and captain who had spent 20 years of his life playing the hide and seek with icebergs as a master of a whaler. My intention was to go on a 3 years' cruise to the Arctic regions and probably remain there, devoting the remainder of my life to the good of those isolated people, running the ship back and forth to the port of some civilized country. After a conversation with Captain Brent, however, I changed my plans and decided to go south instead of north. My reason for this was that Captain Brent had done all of his whaling in southern waters and was familiar with every piece of terra firma in the Straits of Magellan to Kerguelen's Land and knew nothing whatever about the Arctic regions. And inasmuch as my object was to get away and as far away as possible from the haunts of civilized men, I readily agreed and drew the papers for a 3 years' cruise to extend as far south as I should desire, open water permitting. On the 17th day of June, 1895, having on board stores for a 3 years' cruise, $50,000 in gold coin, and in an iron safe in my private cabin, and picked a crew, I sailed out of New York Harbor, literally shaking the dust of my native country from my feet and carrying a lighter heart than I had for months past. It's not necessary to draw out and magnify the incidents of this voyage. There are writers, W. Clark Russell, for instance, whose business in life is to describe sea voyages. The chief interest in this story must lie in what was accomplished by the voyage and not the voyage itself. In my cabin with my books under an awning on the poop with Captain Brent, who was extremely well informed for a seaman, or making myself at home with sailors before the mast, every hour was pleasantly employed. Winds were very favorable considering the season of the year, and we drew down rapidly towards the tropics. On the 10th of August, we crossed the equator, and I brought out half-dozen bottles of wine and a box of cigars, and had the sailors, who were all smart American boys, aft. About the last of September, we passed the Cape and began to realize that we were indeed leaving the habitable world and passing into a solitude of waters whose southern boundaries were well unknown. And here our real voyage began. There's a fierceness and blackness in these waters below the Cape that those familiar only with the ship courses in the Atlantic and Pacific can form no conception of. Wilder and wilder grew the sea as we drew southward, but Captain Brent was an old navigator, and I feared the terrors of the whole Antarctic region was not so much as a single cartoon in an American newspaper. In 151 days after leaving New York, we encountered ice, and a month later we were sailing along the southern ice barriers that towered like sapphire cliffs as far as the eye could see in either direction. It was now summertime in these regions, and Captain Brent said he had never seen the sea so clear of ice. Whales spouted in every direction, and seafowl by thousands sailed above us or perched among the icy precipices. The grandeur of the scenery about us at this time baffles description. As we sailed leisurely east by south, there was a wall of ice on our right ranging from 50 to 300 feet high, giving out with a splendor which no artist may portray. The gorgeous hues of the rainbow, in some places the cliffs overhung, making great grottos in which the largest ship might float. On the 23rd of December, we sighted the lofty summit of Mount Erebus, the only volcano so far as known in the Antarctic regions. On the 29th, turning a spur or promontory of ice that jutted out many miles into the sea, we ran into a great cove, landlocked, or rather ice-locked, where the water was smooth, and where the cliffs shelved up gradually from the water's edge, reaching back and up many thousand feet, to where the opal-tinted ice shaded off into the dull gray and brown of the rugged, barren rocks of Mount Erebus. Standing on the deck of the ship and looking up the wide and irregular incline of ice that extended from the water's edge up to where the rugged sides of Mount Erebus showed above, I enjoyed one of the grandest sights ever looked upon by man. This sloping incline was broken into hundreds of terraces down which the melting snow water dashed in innumerable cascades and poured into the sea, making great banks of fleecy foam that froze and floated away, as it were, gossamer icebergs. As I gazed up at this terraced incline from the placid sea to the towering heights beyond, it looked like a marble stairway leading up to heaven, so broad and grand in its mighty sweep that all the tribes of earth might mount upon it. It was a picture that Milton or Homer might have used in their immortal epics of gods and angels. The water lapping over terraces and leaping downward here and there was as white as milk, and in the distance looked like gauzy draperies of lace and down spread on the mighty stairway as archangels might spread them for gods to walk upon. No grander sight was ever looked upon by seer or prophet in the most enraptured vision. This phenomenon, so remarkable